And we're going to start the program now. Thanks for coming today. Beautiful autumn day. We have a wonderful speaker. Thanks for coming, Mikki. And we have a lot of first-timers, which I'm glad to see. And I hope you come again more than one time. You found us by Meetup, I presume. And if you look at Meetup, you'll see all the other great events that we have on a monthly basis. We have dozens of meetups, for just something for everyone. And Audrey runs our programs, and she does a great job of getting great people to organize particular meetups or to speak like we have today. And which brings me to another issue. I mean, people always want to know what the humanists are. What do they stand for? Well, I have my cheat sheet here. We're a secular community for ethical living. We believe we are committed to the well-being of all and sustainability of the planet. We seek to champion secular moral leadership and educate others about our naturalist philosophy, where the natural world and the one life that each of us has is all and enough. So our motto is secular, nature, ethical, and purpose. So if you are a secular-minded person and ethically motivated, we invite you to join our community for camaraderie, lifelong learning, community service, and secular advocacy for social justice and humanist values. And by the way, my name is Harlan Garbell. I'm the president of the organization. And another thing I'd like to mention is that we are being live streamed. John Walker, who's our treasurer, but also sort of one of his secondary jobs is being one of our technology gurus. And he's done a great job of setting all these wires and things up that I have no idea how it works. But we're being streamed live on YouTube. So we have, I think, a number of people who are watching us on YouTube as we speak. And one of the things I'd like to mention before I forget is that next month we're not going to have our normal community gathering here at the First Unitarian Society. We're going to have our biannual extravaganza, our winter solstice event on December 18th at the Humanities Center in St. Paul. I believe it's on Ivy Street or thereabouts. So we'd like for you to come and be great. Another thing I'd like to mention about, we'd like to have people, you've seen us on Meetup, and if you've been to any of our events, you sort of know what we're about, really. We're about science, reason, lifelong learning, critical thinking, and we would love for you to be members. Inflation is like a big thing now. You read it in the papers, see it in the news, and there was a story I read the other day about some of our old timers will remember the inflation in the 1970s. In 1974, 75, the president at the time, Gerald Ford, talked about, he had a WIN program. Do you know people know what WIN stands for? Anybody know? Exactly, Whip Inflation Now. And this was like a big national campaign for Whip Inflation Now, WIN. And well, that didn't go over too big with the public. But I like to make the case for, we are really involved in WIN here at HumanistsMN. I mean, we've had the same dues, which is $40 a year or 78 cents a week, if you figure it out, 78 cents a week. And ever since I've been a member, it's always been $40 for a basic membership. So we're doing our best to whip inflation. And, I remember even at a board meeting a year or two ago, about 2 years ago, I asked the board, I said, look, isn't it time that we raised our membership dues? I mean, we haven't done it forever. And people said, oh, no, we don't want to do that. We want to keep inflation. They weren't talking about inflation. We want to keep it steady, make this organization friendly for people to join. So, I learned my lesson. So for the foreseeable future, we're going to keep it at $40. Any announcements I want to ask our board members if there's anything I missed in announcements? Oh, no? Okay. So we have a great program today. And Audrey, our program coordinator, is going to announce our speaker. So again, thanks for coming. And we have refreshments. This part of the program lasts about 4:30. Then at that time, we're going to have our social hour, and we're going to have wine and beer and pop. So please feel free to stick around for that social hour and meet some new friends.
Hello, everyone, and good to see you. Thank you for coming out today. I'm really pleased to have my friend, Mikki Morrissette, here with us today. Some of you do know that I'm also here a member of First Unitarian Society, which is a humanist congregation, as is Mikki. And it's lovely to have a fellow humanist speak to us today. Mikki has been involved in publishing for a long, long time, lifelong. She is a native Minnesotan, but we were reminiscing a little bit about our stints in New York. I did a stint of 16 years in New York when I was a bit younger, and I found out that Mikki did too. She was in publishing in New York City for 18 years, where some of the jobs she had were project manager for the New York Times in their new media department, and also working in different capacities for Time Inc. After that time in New York City and having a little one, she decided to move back to Minnesota, which was pretty much the same trajectory. When I had small children, I moved back to Minnesota, an easier place to raise a family. But Mikki did something really interesting, fascinating. She wrote and spoke about being a single parent and choosing single motherhood. And she wrote a book about that, over 20 years ago, or about 20 years ago. And so she came back here to the Twin Cities, but then traveled around the country doing workshops on that very topic. And during that time, raising her family, she had a second child. She was a freelance communications specialist here in the Twin Cities. And in 2017, late in 2017, she bought the Minnesota Women's Press, where she is now publisher and editor. And that has given her just great insight and experience and tentacles of going into the community here in the Twin Cities to uncover all kinds of wonderful things that are happening here in the Twin Cities, and Mikki is going to share with us this afternoon. I think I have that right. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Mikki Morrissette.
Well, thank you, Audrey. Let me get myself set up here so find my ear behind my hair. All right. Am I good? Am I good? Okay. Well, it's good to be here. Yes, as Audrey said, I spend a bit of time upstairs also. I've been part of the First Unitarian Society for, it's about 9 or 10 years, I think now. And yes, my kids now are 22 and almost 18. Okay, all right. So Audrey and I had talked about this a couple months ago. What kind of would I be interested in talking about with the Humanist Society? And really what was coming to the front was, what if women ruled the world? I don't mean in that Amazon warrior vein. There were actually women buried with their weapons in remote areas of Russia. But really imagining what life would be like today if we had been built from matriarchy instead of patriarchy. So, thank you for inviting me to share these thoughts with you today. I'm going to cover a lot of different areas, some good, some bad, a lot of speculation and some realities, as Audrey said, from the tentacles I have out in the state of Minnesota with women. So I will talk about the awesomeness of women more in a bit, but first I'd like to explore a concept that perhaps is even closer to home for most of you here in this room. About 100 years ago, John Dietrich gave a talk imagining what the world might be like if it was led by humanists. Dietrich, as some of you might know, was the co-founder of religious humanism, who came to Minneapolis to form a humanist congregation in 1916 by the founding members of the First Unitarian Society here in this building. Dietrich said, if the world went humanist, there would be a recognition of the essential unity of mankind. We would realize that there flows through the whole human race one life and one blood, and we would all march on together toward our common purpose and common ideal, realizing that what hurts one hurts all. A few years ago, I had the luxury of being paid by the Minnesota Historical Society to go through all of Dietrich's talks and create a database of the contents that are stored here at First Unitarian Society. If the world went humanist, I think I know some of the things that Dietrich would have done differently. He would have revised our system of justice. He pointed out that we condemn the man who steals a loaf of bread while we pay honor to the man who steals $1 million. In 1926, he gave a talk called The Scientific Attitude Toward Crime. He said research showed that preventing crime with prison is not successful. If the goal is vengeance, sure, prison as punishment makes sense, but if the goal is to reduce crime, it does not make sense. The reason we have prison instead of crime prevention, he said, is that the public is generally opposed to using taxpayer money for reform rather than for punishment. He said the opposition to reform justice tends to come from people who never read a book on criminology and people who never had direct dealings with prisoners. When people are afraid, he said, they tend to believe in irrational methods of protection. He said anthropology, biology, psychology, sociology are furnishing us with volumes of information about the springs of human conduct. He said, I believe an offender should be detained as long as he is a menace to public safety, but he should be detained for only one reason, to restore him to physical, mental, and moral health. If the world went humanist, would we be working on reform instead of vengeance? Dietrich also believed in the concept of dying with dignity, which is something that Compassion and Choices continues trying to enact into law here in Minnesota. They've been losing the battle, largely because of religious pushback at the legislative level. In a speech called The Right to Die, Dietrich said, when one considers the handicaps and frustrations that are imposed upon life from the beginning, one wonders why it suddenly becomes invested with such sanctity at the end. We may not wish to die with our boots on, but we may well prefer to die with our brains on. My dad had dementia. We talked about dying with dignity legislation, and he told me he would have loved the opportunity to choose his timing of death. Instead, he also had to go through the intense discomfort of congestive heart failure before he died last year. I wish Dietrich had been able to lead his humanist approach to dying in this state 100 years ago. One of Dietrich's very first talks here was a few years before women had the right to vote. He said, the trouble with our government is that it is a government of men, by men, and for men, with the result that it is not so much human as masculine. What is our country without the influence of women stamped upon it? I love that, of course. As editor and publisher of Minnesota Women's Press, starting in my 5th year in January, my job is to find and share the stories of the women who are movers and shakers in our communities. These tend to be people at the grassroots level who know what the problems are and work collaboratively with others to get them solved. It is a very humanist concept. The world might not be as humanist as we would like to see, but let's go back to my earlier question and narrow it a bit. What if women had ruled the United States from the start? Yep.
I once read the article, so I'll title it When Women Ruled the World, the Queens of Egypt.
Oh, so they did rule the world in Egypt.
And they ruled, yeah, I think they must have ruled like Egypt, you know.
Okay.
I won't tell you the name of Nefertiti is. They disrupted, she appeared a lot, but she just had a higher fault.
Yeah? All right, I'll look up Nefertiti. I don't know much about Egypt's history. The Amazons, I know, were the myths of Greece that led into modern day. So if women had led Western expansion of the U.S., do we think the relationships with pre-existing indigenous communities would have been different? Do we think slavery would have happened? In more recent history, would the war on drugs have put so many black people in prisons rather than working on policies to lift people out of poverty and trauma? Would consolidation of farming into corn and soybeans and meat factories have squeezed so many small farmers out of business and hurt our ecosystems with pollution and dying soil? Would more subsidies today be going to regenerative practices? Would the bulk of our crime reduction efforts be put into violence prevention and healing trauma instead of policing budgets? Would the average pay of corporate leaders be more than $24 million annually, a doubling in 10 years, while the federal minimum wage remains at $7.25 per hour? Would the average pay of caregivers be less than $10 an hour? Would monopolies like Amazon be able to set the pricing and wages that tend to sideline local businesses? If women were in charge, would gender-based violence continue to exist so extensively? Would our language change to reflect the reality that men rape rather than women get raped? I will not stand here and say that all women have more egalitarian values, because we know that is not true. I will also not stand here and say that everyone in positions of power use it to their own advantage. That is also not always the case. But in general, women do tend to be trained as collaborative caretakers. I believe it is long past time when we have much more of that kind of leadership. I think strong leadership is about building trust. We know how much our institutions are lacking right now in that regard: government, media, education, corporate America, courts of law. Most people have lost faith in at least a few of our institutions. Someone I interviewed a few years ago, who has become a good friend, talked to me about conscious capitalism. She said something that sticks with me. Women who make powerful leaders do not need to be the smartest person in the room. They believe in non-hierarchical decision-making. This leadership is about collaboration, not competition. The issues we face are complex because of their intersecting natures. Unhealed trauma from violence and exploitation can lead to substance abuse and emotional stress, which leads to issues of housing and job security, which leads to reduced family care and education, which leads to struggles with economics and crime that cycle back into insecurities in housing and income and education, which perpetuate substance use and gender-based violence and emotional trauma. This complexity very much requires collaborative solutions that involve a kind of multitasking awareness, not a linear, silver bullet, or top-down approach. I think strong leadership is about vulnerability, sharing stories, acknowledging mistakes, and talking openly about lessons learned. Many people are reluctant to do this, myself very much included. with women and people of color tend to be held to a higher standard anyway, which is why it's not a very easy path to walk. But if things were run by women, I think this would eventually become a strength, not a liability, and we could all be less traumatized by the stigmas and fears and secrets that ultimately guide us. We would be more out in the open about them. And I think that, as much as anything, would help us become a much healthier society. I also think we have a semantics issue in defining what leadership is. For hundreds of years, really, we have defined leadership as taking charge, being conquering heroes, claiming what is not necessarily your own, taking resources and using them to your own advantage. In the case most recently played out in Kenosha, Wisconsin, it's about staking a claim to protect your own vision of justice and might, using assault weapons if so desired.
More like thousands of years.
Yeah. Yeah, grotesque as what happened there, as well as at the US Capitol earlier this year, and so many cases throughout history. There is growing pushback, I believe, against that type of leadership, and that's where we are now. It's largely coming from women, blacks, indigenous, and people of color who have been on the short end of that type of leadership for centuries. I believe the new definition of leadership is about working alongside peers to lift each other up. It's what parenting and volunteerism have trained so many to do. It's not simply about being a director, but being a part of a community. It's about navigating the conflicts that come from differing opinions rather than simply shooting down those that you don't agree with. This is admittedly hard for all of us to do, but I believe it is essential to move towards supporting leaders who recognize why the health of the entire ecosystem is essential. It requires figuring out how to engage apart from institutions and bubbles. Minnesota Women's Press recently worked with a journalist from Bosnia, Amra, who interviewed 10 women we set her up with involved in behind-the-scenes or front-stage politics. People like Senator Mary Kanush and Reviving Sisterhood director Nashina Hussain and Wellstone activist Pam Costain. Amra was in this fellowship program with us because she's trying to figure out how people in her country can perceive women as political leaders in what is a patriarchal culture. The beauty of the conversations, of course, are that the people she talked to are considered transformational leaders here in Minnesota for being role models for women's leadership. Yet every one of them recognizes that even our great progress over the past few decades still gets us to much less than 50-50 gender representation in political and business leadership. And every one of them said one of the hard parts, besides getting more people to trust women's leadership, is to convince more women that they are indeed leaders. Increasingly, we see women in leadership roles and don't define it as such. We don't even perceive ourselves as leaders. It's a narrative we've been working to shift with Minnesota Women's Press since it started in 1985 with Molly and Glenda, and later with Norma and Kathy, who I bought the magazine from. Our tagline after I bought the magazine is "Powerful, Everyday Women." So far, I've been talking in generalities, and I want to talk a little bit more in specifics. So let me start with gender-based violence. Do you remember it wasn't that long ago when domestic violence was considered a private matter in the home that polite society did not talk about? Why did that ever seem like a good idea? It was Sheila Wellstone here in Minnesota who began traveling around the state, bringing conversations out into the open that led to the Violence Against Women Act, increased resources for women's shelters, and helped us realize that there should be nothing about abuse that is not a community matter. A lot of collaborative leadership went into that work. And she started her quest as a librarian in Northfield who noticed news clippings about domestic violence that seemed to be treating it as inconsequential. Our policies are also changing slowly over a few decades of women pushing for deeper understanding of trauma. Prostitutes are not referred to and arrested in the same way now. Personally, I think our terminology for sex trafficking needs to change too. Referring to Johns, for example, instead of men who buy sex, is a soft approach. I presume many of us followed the recent Minneapolis voting debate about public safety. There has been a recognition lately that embedding social workers with police or sending crisis teams to deal with mental health and domestic violence and substance use calls would be more effective. One Hennepin County social worker told me that 75% of police calls are responding to the same issues with the same individuals. Social workers can help to lead more people into treatment rather than into the court and jail systems. It's a great idea, right? Did you also know that the same idea was implemented in the 1980s? Social workers and trained specialists were being sent on calls. In 1984, for example, the Minneapolis Intervention Project was organized to offer community-coordinated responses to domestic violence. Teams of female volunteers were dispatched with police to sites of domestic abuse. During the first year of the program, 62% of offenders were ordered into counseling and 45% into treatment, up from 14%. And we let the funding for that kind of work lapse. Instead, we still require women volunteers and low-paid behavioral health specialists to be behind-the-scenes support staff without much of a budget. John Dietrich would not be impressed with those progressive values. In Minneapolis, for example, the police department has a budget of $180 million in 2021. In comparison, the newly enhanced budget for the Office of Violence Prevention is $7.4 million. Hennepin County and 12 cities had $969,000 budgeted in 2020 for embedded social workers. In 2022, a $1.3 million budget will serve 29 cities. And again, our police budget for Minneapolis alone is $180 million in comparison. And that doesn't include the budget for incarceration and the rest of the legal system. Why haven't we been funding programs to reduce violence? Why was Duluth the only Minnesota city, for example, that became known nationwide for getting domestic assault perpetrators into treatment that worked? There are more than 21,000 women in Minneapolis alone who report domestic violence each year. On average, police make reports or arrests in response to only 20% of those calls. It's only now that the locally based Global Rights for Women has been funded to work with Minneapolis police, survivors, and advocates to find better solutions that do not only involve calling police when there is a crisis situation. Which part? Yeah, Global Rights for Women has just been funded to work with Minneapolis police, survivors, and advocates to find better solutions that do not only involve calling police when there is a crisis situation. Minnesota Women's Press will be reporting on this in 2022. There are examples of great changes that have started to address long-standing social issues. So let me share some of those with you now that we've gone through some of the sad stuff. Nearly 10 years ago, a treatment facility doctor and a judge in southwest Minnesota recognized that drug court participants were struggling. The women especially would enter recovery programs, graduate, then have nowhere to go. They were lacking support, transportation, childcare, and would sometimes return to unhealthy relationships out of economic necessity. It's hard for people with criminal backgrounds to qualify for rental housing. So an actual solution was created by forming a team of community partnerships. A planning committee included people from the school district, probation officers, the county prosecutor and public defender, city council members, public health representatives, a drug court graduate, and property management staff. Today, the Solace apartment complex in St. Peter operates as a housing first model, which prioritizes permanent housing over sobriety. A person is not kicked out immediately if they use alcohol or drugs, but are coaxed back into support. Solace has only 30 units and a very lengthy wait list. 3 people told the story of Solace for our June issue of called Reconstruction. I recently delivered a gift box to one of them for her 2nd year of sobriety. April's story with us was vulnerable, honest, and powerful. She has been upfront about the fact that she relapsed after she got into her housing and why. As she wrote, "A person might assume that I was most vulnerable while being unsheltered and addicted to meth. Honestly, I felt most vulnerable when my chaotically packed psychological boxes were being dumped out during therapy. There were new coping mechanisms for anxiety and confusion, mixed with the intense novelty of feeling true emotions without the buffer of substance use. I was raw, and it was hard. When I moved into my space at Solace, I had no driver's license, my vehicle was impounded, and I did not have custody of my 3 children full-time. Emotionally and psychologically, I was hardly capable of opening my mail without panic or going to the gas station independently, let alone supporting myself or my 3 little girls. As an alcoholic and an addict, my response was always to escape difficulty or mistakes by running away or numbing. I knew nothing of facing difficult emotions, pushing through, or being consistent. An artist program at Solace helped me learn perseverance on canvas, consequently building confidence by realizing that mistakes are only as big as you allow them to be. This lesson spilled into my personal life in a truly beautiful way. Taking breaths, the process of creating beauty out of mistakes and never throwing anything away was so important. I'm quite emotional writing this. I'm realizing how therapeutic that process was for me. April is a leader. She works alongside her community in support, has testified to the Minnesota legislators about the value of housing programs like Solace, and is back to raising her 3 girls. As she put it in her story, it was because of my community that I was allowed the grace to stumble. This is how true healing begins. We've also told the story of Danny, her mother, her sister, and her aunt, who are up in Tower, Minnesota, creating an aeroponic farming system. Danny's mother, Denise, realized that their indigenous tribe in that area would not be getting some of the fruits and vegetables that were very important to their diets once the fossil fuels began to run out and people weren't driving things into Tower, Minnesota anymore. So they're setting about, and they've told the story in our pages about this aeroponic farming that they're doing. We've also told the story of Alicia, who lives, she's a massage therapist in her 20s who lives on the border with South Dakota in a very small town called Jasper. She said that Jasper, the agricultural area around Jasper, had started dying in the 70s and 80s. The school then closed. Kids were shipped out to a different school district outside, well outside of their area. Businesses downtown closed. And so what she's doing now is she's worked with a community of her peers in transforming one of the closed schools' houses, and they're turning it into a community space where people will be happy to come, whether it's for a brewery or maker's market or other creative spaces where they can gather again together and have a reason for people to come so that Jasper can thrive again as a community. I actually met with 7 women in Granite Falls, which is 2 hours south and west of here, a couple weeks ago, who have done a very similar thing in their community, transforming, especially through the arts, some vitality in their community. And that's going to be a story in our December issue. There's Angela Dawson, who I've gotten to know over the last couple of years. She runs a hemp farm in Sandstone, central Minnesota, and has created a co-op out of it so that other black farmers around the country like herself can benefit from each other's experience and resources. So it's not just about her, and it's not just about her farm, but it's about trying to lift up many black farmers as they're trying to get footing that doesn't get subsidized very well. She also had a wonderful way of saying that there's all these young, as she calls them, badass tattooed young men that are coming to her farm looking for work because she uses regenerative practices and her farm is thriving. And they have uncles and fathers whose farms are not thriving. So there's a lot of these beacons. And I know that here you've had your own conversations with great visionary leaders like this, people with what I consider feminist collaborative values. And they're not always women. I know you had Timothy Denherter Thomas here. I met him quite a few years ago. Had him on a couple speaking programs I did about sustainability, who's involved with community solar, especially for low income. I know you've had Michelle Braley, who's involved with restorative justice, Winona LaDuke, who's always out there on environmental activism. These are all great collaborative, not competitive leaders. And I have a few more thoughts to share, but before I do, I want to throw out a question for you guys to maybe talk amongst yourselves with people that are sitting next to you for a bit. I want you to kind of think about somebody that you consider a true leader. It doesn't have to be somebody that you know. It could be somebody in the news. It could be somebody you know. It doesn't have to be a woman. Think about who that might be, and then talk amongst yourselves for a little bit about what you admire about that person's abilities. How do you think they've accomplished what they have? It's not an easy question, because we tend to focus on the accomplishments themselves and not necessarily the values involved in getting there. But if you take just a couple minutes I'll get some water while you guys get to chat.
Just get into little groups.
Okay, why don't you take like one more minute to wrap up, and then I'll ask a few volunteers to share.
Check 1, 2.
All right, why don't we come back? And yeah, I'd love for anybody who wants to share something about what they talked about. Could be your own, could be what somebody else raised that struck you. Got a little microphone. Who wants to volunteer?
One of the people who came up for us was Irene O'Neill, who is a subversive nun, part of St. Kate's, and she has started a thing called Sisters Rising Worldwide, and she's creating a network through technology for all the nuns who are boots on the ground and who know exactly what the problems are in these communities so that they can communicate with one another and fill each other's needs. And she also creates a lot of, she's a rainmaker. People donate a lot of money, but she is the most unassuming person. She's actually our neighbor downstairs. She's the most unassuming person. And this Sisters Rising Worldwide is doing so much good. She is a real leader with her heart in the right place and good humanist values. What is she doing? What she is doing is working, well, number one, she is creating, not she herself because she's not a tech person, but she's gotten the people to create, to furnish the nuns all over the world. And I'm talking about like nuns in little small places like in Africa, but they have computers now. And that she's helped to create a website and is signing people up, all these nuns. There's about, I don't know, 250,000 nuns. And you know, people think that the Catholic Church supports nuns financially, but they don't really. The nuns are on their own. So it's not part of the Catholic gigantic corporation. So what she's doing is, number one, creating this website. Number two, speaking to the individual nuns and getting people signed in so that they can say, hey, if we could get enough money to buy a van so that the girls who attend our school don't have to walk down this certain road where they're preyed upon by sex traffickers, if they could be in a van, that wouldn't happen. And she works with people who want to donate money, not so much by asking, but inspiring them. So in this particular case, a van was purchased, and these girls no longer get picked up by sex traffickers. So that's what she's doing. And it's going very well. You can check out the website. She is a real leader and 100% ethical. And all the money that she raises goes to the people they're trying to help. Sisters Rising Worldwide. And her name is Irene O'Neill, S.J. She is a Catholic nun, but I call her a subversive nun. And really, at heart, she's a humanist. She really is.
Well, I brought up my Uber boss. Her name is Jennifer Ho. She is a commissioner of Minnesota Housing. She started, when I knew her, she was the executive director at Hearth Connection, I believe, in the Wellstone Center, maybe, back then. I don't know where it is now. But anyway, from there she went and served in the Obama administration for his term, and after that she came back and she became commissioner of Minnesota Housing. And she is a wonderful leader. She's a very out queer woman and very strong. She cares about her troops. I've been at Minnesota Housing for about 6 years now, and she and the other bosses at Minnesota Housing, where they work a whole lot harder than the rest of us. I'm a IT guy there, so I'm kind of deep in the onion as far as things that happen. But she's very busy nowadays with the assistance programs, the forbearance, and everything else that's Minnesota is doing to help people stay in their house, in their home, in their apartment. But anyway, that's who I brought up.
Thanks. Nathan and I struggled a little bit to come up with prominent people. Maybe it's just I'm not alert to that stuff. And we were thinking a little closer to the line what Craig was saying, though this person is prominent, relatively prominent. But everyday people can be leaders and significant. He mentioned to the corporation he worked at, he said, yeah, the CEO was a stinker, just a jerk. But there were a couple of these middle-level managers, people went to them. People knew they could get results, or everybody liked them. You feel like anybody can be a leader. It doesn't have to come with an official title. And just by being who you are and how you interact with people, kind of like you mentioned, it's probably about collaboration and problem solving together and these sorts of things that make you a leader in part. Thank you.
I'd just like to say a few words about Donna. Oh, Donna. Interfaith outreach. Donna LaHoy. It's just mental block. But she started it as a nothing thing 25 years ago. And they provided services to the whole city, really, thousands of families. And of course she had help. She found people that helped her. But she's retired now. I know she stepped down. Do you know my pronunciation? LaHoy?
I don't.
I get the name mixed up, and I
terrible about
apologize.
pronunciation.
I'm not doing her the service she deserves.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are great examples, and I'm going to have to look up Irene O'Neill. I wasn't familiar with her. Yeah. So, and we're actually hoping to connect with Jennifer Ho for our February issue on statewide equity related to housing, big package on housing. So, and I welcome, by the way, after I'm done talking, we connect in the community to find out who we should be talking with and who should be. We do first person narratives in a lot of the cases. So we look for a lot of lived experiences, people talking from their own heart, not, again, that sort of top-down reporting where you come in and you figure out a few things and then you leave. So it's unique what we're doing, and we're always just finding stories in the community. So I have just a few other things I want to bring up, and first I want to say this is not related to whoever anybody voted for in the most recent election, but I do want to talk about a recent Star Tribune endorsement for the Minneapolis mayor that made me angry. Mayor Frey was given a lot of credit in the editorial for not being intimidated by protesters who asked him to defund the police. And while strength in the face of opposition is admirable if you do indeed have values that you can publicly explain, I also think it's arrogant that a large group of community members who care deeply about public safety are not invited or had not been invited to be part of a solution. The Star Tribune editorial applauded Frey for standing up to a city council that had other ideas. It indicated that in its voting choices, Minneapolis residents can be guided toward prudent reforms by traditional progressive values. I'm not sure what that is, or it can go in reckless pursuit, it said, of radical visions detached from reality. The editorial quoted Frey as saying, "I haven't caved. I have refused to compromise on what I feel is best for Minneapolis." So again, whether you voted for Mayor Frey or not, my question is, why would an endorsement for a leader not value listening and taking steps with others to find solutions? In St. Paul, a task force of 48 stakeholders was put together after George Floyd's murder and the subsequent protests to discuss in public meetings over 5 months how that city should handle public safety differently. St. Paul now has a concrete set of recommendations for transformation, including the development of an Office of Neighborhood Safety to focus on crime prevention and creating, quote, "a deliberate space to engage neighbors and community-based organizations in the work to ensure that all residents feel safe." And if you'll allow me just a few more moments for another rant of sorts, I also don't know why we don't vote more often for people with lived experiences. There were many strong women of color who ran in the last legislative races, and very few of them were elected. If we want to see true progressive values and a radical vision for a better reality, why do we still have so many people in office who have not experienced health disparities, economic challenges, the juggling of work-life balances, including childcare and elder care, and housing insecurities? Years ago, I did a special project for the New York Times in which we collected archival material about presidential campaign coverage from the late 1800s to the age of television. Many of these candidates, often speaking in the back of trains in small towns along a railroad line, talked about what they valued. I'm disappointed that politics today has not evolved into a chance to see how well prospective leaders roll up their sleeves and listen, not simply talk, and collaborate with others in finding solutions. I do largely blame media for our focus on the competitive nature of politics rather than the collaborative. Since the days we saw John F. Kennedy suave and smooth next to Richard Nixon on TV, we have admittedly been on a slippery slope downhill. Clickbait, provocative headlines, talking head debates, none of it is about listening to each other. It's not a surprise that we're deeply fraying at the edges. Someone in a monthly conversation group I co-hosted for several years at Lake Harriet Spiritual Center said that humans are better at labeling each other as nouns and categories, rather than as seeing each other as fellow beings in the process of evolution together. I think we are getting ourselves cornered into a place where we have to do so much posturing and virtue signaling and chest thumping, cues from broadcast media, really, that we have lost the ability to honor vulnerabilities. We see listening as weakness, we incarcerate trauma, and we consider compromise as losing. I think it's largely women who will have to lead us someplace different, model a different type of leadership that bit by bit will transform society. There are a lot of things we are afraid of, and one of those, ironically, is about showing fear. We're more likely to get angry than to admit to what scares us, and I wonder kind of why that is. Minnesota Women's Press currently has a survey online. Our question is, what are you afraid of? We ask people to assess their depth of fear about at least 20 things. What is overwhelmingly at the top of the survey so far, even more so than climate change and white supremacy and gun violence, is political polarization. I see that your own humanist leader, Harlan, recently wrote an essay that the real plague of the 21st century is fear. He wrote that humans are seeking ways to tackle the problems that are the root causes of this fear. And that is indeed where I think our salvation will come from, as we work to move leadership away from a competitive top dog model. I think we will all get better about having authentic conversations and conflict resolution and reform, using true community connections rather than some macho king of the hill, I win approach, or even the cancel culture approach that also avoids authentic community-based reform. In January, Minnesota Women's Press will kick off a new Changemakers Alliance. These are basically online salons to blend metro and suburban and rural people together in discussions about 4 rotating topics: healing trauma, regenerating ecosystems, transforming justice, and creating equitable and cooperative economies. We'll talk together about story ideas, solutions to amplify from powerful everyday leaders, and action steps that we can support in solidarity. I appreciate this opportunity to connect with you here today, and I do welcome, as I said, every one of you to offer me story ideas, to join the Changemakers Alliance. You can go to the womenspress.com website for more information about that. You can also find our fear survey there, which I encourage all of you to take and share it widely around the state. We don't want the demographics to reflect only our 25,000 largely Twin Cities-based readers. You can subscribe, you can donate, you can read our free online essays there. The December issue that we just closed this week, I write an edit letter that says that 2022 will be our year of solutions. We're going to be focusing on what we can do together to solve long-standing issues. In January, we're actually creating a magazine specifically focused on fears, including results of the current survey. In February, as I mentioned, it's about statewide equity and some of the priorities of the next legislative session. In April, we're exploring the transition movement that binds communities around buy local and food security. In June, we'll focus on stigma and addiction. I encourage you to take any of the magazines that I have over here to see what we've shared this past year. We ran out of our big issue on missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, but we've got one here on gender-based violence that came out last month, and the current issue about ecolution, which is a word I made up, about revolutionizing sustainable ecosystems and economies. So as John Dietrich knew 100 years ago, the world needs visionaries to step into leadership. If the world went humanist, there would be recognition of the essential unity of mankind. We would realize that there flows through the whole human race one life and one blood, and we would all march on together toward our common purpose and common ideal, realizing that what hurts one hurts all. So together, let's make this world a rollicking good feminist and humanist utopia. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that wonderful presentation. And this is the part of the program where we have question and answers. So this is your opportunity. If there's anything that you want to ask Mikki regarding what she had to say, please pipe up. I have a question. Women leaders. One of the leaders, I didn't mention this in my little group here, was Hillary Clinton. I followed her entire adult life. And I thought she was a spectacular leader, even from college, high school actually, on to the time that she was First Lady, and then beyond when she was a U.S. Senator, and then ran for president. And I was always curious, I read some polls, how many other women just didn't like Hillary Clinton. And it was not so much a political thing about her views, but they didn't like her personality or the way she did business. They thought maybe she was too, perhaps, masculine and being too competitive. Mm-hmm. Do you have any thoughts on why a lot of women just didn't care for Hillary Clinton?
Yeah, it is puzzling. I don't have an answer to that other than the fact that I know that even in the, that I know that we had a lot of look at kind of how Clinton compared to Trump. And I know that a lot of people are looking again for sort of a macho version of leadership. And Hillary Clinton is kind of neither macho nor as feminine as some women like to see. And I don't know. I don't have a real answer for it other than the fact that I think it's hard to know what to make of women who are stepping into power who don't mirror either what you yourself feel like a woman is, or who don't have the same kind of chutzpah in the same sort of way that other leaders who get elected do.
I'm starting back here, and then we'll come up front.
Basically, Hillary was too much like a guy, so she didn't have the collaborative approach, she was more competitive approach.
More too competitive. Yeah, well, that could be. Yeah, she was not soft enough, and she was also not, well, I don't know, who knows. Yeah.
Trump, the T is silent in his name.
Yes.
This is Marcia. She has a question.
Okay.
Yes, can you hear me okay with my mask? Okay. I won't spit on the microphone then. But I don't know why this came to me while you were speaking, but I think one of the, what came was Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. And he talks about white body trauma. And I wonder if our society can't heal because we have not, as white people, looked at the trauma that we brought with us as settlers. And then that caused us to colonize rather than live peacefully amongst the people who were here first. We know about boarding schools and genocide and land stealing causing trauma to Native Americans. We know about slavery and the evils of that, what that did to black people. But have we talked at all as a country about, what happened to white people? Why were we such savages? And why were we so fiercely patriarchal?
Yeah, that's an excellent book. And I agree that I think one of the things Women's Press is planning to do a lot going forward is keep focusing on the trauma aspect of things. I think trauma is at the root of everything that's causing, it's just cascading generation after generation, and we've done nothing yet to help relieve some of that pressure. So I think trauma, and again, we incarcerate it. We don't know what to do with people who are dealing with a lot of emotional stress, a lot of economic stress, turning to substance use and other things, and we incarcerate it. We just try to put it away, and that has to change. And I think I think that's an area where if we funded and budgeted that effectively, we would start to see some major shifts in how we operate as a society. So, and again, I do think that's, that caregiving aspect is going to be something where women are going to have to push and lead to get that funded so that we can do a better job.
Hi, thank you. Something you just said and have been talking about has me just a little bit, a little anxious. Maybe this is showing my fear and probably my political persuasion. But a lot of what you're talking about is so wonderful, but it also requires
political change, for funding for a lot of things, and how do you deal with the push in this country, not at our state level yet, but that could change next year, depending on who is the governor, with the legislatures who are pretty much disenfranchising people's votes. I mean, how do you look forward with hope and positivity and motivation to keep going, knowing that even with the will, even with so many people, the majority behind you, that a lot of the politicians in our country just, if they don't like it, they can just change what the people want. I mean, how do you cope with that? How do you stay motivated? That would be helpful.
Yeah, it is up and down. I get angry at times. I got angry about the public safety debate. There's no easy solutions, but I feel like we have to do something. And I do think that what gives me inspiration and motivation, especially with the job I'm lucky enough to do, is that we have individual pockets all over the place that can find each other and keep working together, because ultimately the humanist vision is the stronger one, and we have not had enough strength over the years to deal with everything that's been happening financially and in terms of violence and stuff. But you know, the Me Too movement is just one symbol of the fact that as people get more communicative with each other, social media has lots of bad things about it, but it also does give us a chance to connect with people all over the place that we never used to have the capability of doing. So I believe that we are actually moving in the direction of being able to cooperate and collaborate more. We just need to have more. Again, if you think about what Stacey Abrams and her whole team did, there's many, many women like that, many people like that, and especially because we've been so fired up about how deeply depressing several years recently have been and continue to be in many different ways. I do think there's just more and more people, and my daughter's 22. We always talk about how the youth are the future and stuff like that, but there are so many people now that are just putting their foot down and saying, I don't care if this is how we've always done things. This doesn't make any sense. And certainly I had a generational conversation about that related to sexual assault. We got my mother and a friend's mom and myself and my friend, and then our kids together, and we talked about how different the generations handled things, that are considered assault now or harassment, and women today aren't putting up with it. And in my generation, it was sort of like, well, it made us really uncomfortable, but there was nothing we could do about it. And in my mother's generation, and her mother had the same thing. It's like it was sort of seen as like, well, at least they're interested in me. So that kind of thing. We are shifting perceptions. It's just very slow and a slow process, and there's pushback that's just inevitable. So.
It's taken a lot of work.
Yeah.
For every generation, but they've been working on every generation's work.
Yeah.
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 I happen to think that even more powerful than our political people is the visual press. I mean, I'm so happy that you have the visualization that you have. I would like to see someone like you or you to start a news program so that we can be as influential as the programs that are being told to us today.
Yeah.
We only know about our politicians and climate change and everything else going on by what they tell us.
Yeah. I will say, this will be my plug on, journalism and media. Community-based journalism is struggling, as we know. Over the pandemic, we lost a couple things. City Pages, which did great investigative stuff. Southwest Journal, there's things coming back to try to replace those once the pandemic is a little bit more past us, but it's advertising based, and we struggle. Women's Press has certainly struggled, and is still struggling, but it's hard to kind of get the resources you need to build up things when it's largely a free enterprise, and it used to be based on advertising, which you can't really rely on now. Our model's always been based on small business advertisers. We lost 40% of that. But there's more push also about collaborative journalism so that we can pool resources. I have been in conversations with places like SPNN in St. Paul, the Uptake is somebody, I've been working with that editor. We're trying to figure out if we can get any kind of grant money or donation money towards building a collaborative, cooperative media entity in Minnesota, which I would personally like to do. I'm a few years away from retirement, and I want to make sure that by the time I go, I have basically a co-op of co-owners who are young to work together to take Minnesota Women's Press on. Honestly, though, I've tried to connect with, Star Tribune, NPR. There's another new publication out that's got more than $1 million in funding, and they're not really interested in collaborating. But I do have in Serene Sadaz, the person who leads the Uptake, and she and I are talking about the fact that we need to because she's got also journalism, media, TV and radio people connected to her. So we're trying to get there because I do think small community newspapers are disappearing, and Minnesota is very strong, but not. We're still losing a lot of voice. So, and frankly, I haven't been very pleased with some of the Star Tribune coverage. So, I think it's helpful to have a lot of different voices.
How do we communicate with the Women's Press if we have an idea for somebody or some organization that you might be interested in?
I did not think to bring my cards. However, it's very easy to find me. Just write to editor@womenspress.com. And also, if you take one of the magazines, you'll see how to reach. But yeah, I'm editor at womenspress.com, and I get a lot of different ideas and mostly a lot of press releases that I ignore, but I always pay attention to the ones that, you could put story idea or whatever, or just put in the subject line, from the Humanist Society, and I'll open it. So thank you.
We have a question from Christine Retko, who's on the board and also co-chairs Humanists in Action with Marcy, who asked a question just a few minutes ago.
Thank you. Forgive that. Thank you so much for all of your presentation. I love your words, and while I do feel some of Marcy's anxiety, the hope that is what pushes me out of bed every day, because this is not good enough. We can do better. We're doing better, as your generational example showed, but we can do even better. One thing that occurred to me I didn't catch her name, but recognizing why do we do these things? Why historically have we done this damage and harm to people? It reminded me of what I've been hearing about parenting, making space, especially for male children, to feel their emotions and express them in more healthy ways. Because when you don't know how to handle and process through any pain or fear or aggressive feelings you have, you're going to do harsh aggression, perhaps. And I just wondered on that theme, do you have any thoughts? I think there's a positive trend. I think parenting trends have changed. We have a stay-at-home male parent there. You're being awesome, I'm sure. There you go. What thoughts on that theme do you have? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. By the way, our October issue, I didn't go through all of our months, but our October issue leading up to the election is going to be how are we serving our children? And it'll very much look at, well, also the critical race theory that's causing a lot of issues around, what we're teaching our kids, and whether we want to make them feel uncomfortable by learning about how terribly we've treated people. So that'll be part of it, but it'll also be related to how are we serving them in other ways. I will say that just on this past Sunday here at First Unitarian Society, they had a little storybook thing. They do this for all ages thing, and they had a storybook reading that was lovely, and I want to find the book because it was a very simple thing about how when you feel afraid and when you feel afraid but don't know what to do about it, you tend to get angry and act out, and then you might go to school and treat people really badly because you don't know what else to do. And I think if everybody read that simple message and we talked about it again more openly, I do think people would start to recognize where the source of a lot of things come from, and that it is fear, it is trauma, and until we start talking about it, nothing's going to change. So.
Okay, so I drive an hour and 45 minutes to be with the society of my peers, and people that think like I do. And I'm from a very rural part of Minnesota. So what do we have that helps lift these women out? I don't know of any. I've been down there, I see it constantly. You're not gonna get into the papers. You're not gonna get into the school board. So what do we do to help these women?
Yeah. That one reason I'm going around to some of the other towns, smaller towns outside of the Twin Cities metro, is so that I can learn a little bit from what women there are doing. The women in Granite Falls were a great example of, in their case, what they said is it's a lot of women that have these ideas and then the men basically help execute them. But the women have kind of been able to step up and because they have each other, support each other in let's figure out how to do this. So they have a unique sort of combination that they've created there. In the case of Alicia in Jasper, she was really fired up about making sure that the community had something different. And so she had this idea, in the case of both places, they said you need to have a meeting place where you can gather and connect and feel camaraderie with people around you, because feeling that you are feeling super isolated and you don't feel like you've got a lot of power, you don't have a lot of inspiration. We are hoping that Changemakers Alliance will help women in, we had a test, we did 3 conversations last summer where we tested having people join a conversation from all over the different parts of the state. And our conversation on healthy ecosystems had people in northern Minnesota, central Minnesota, Twin Cities, southern Minnesota, and they were all aligned in the fact that they wanted to create healthy ecosystems, and they were doing things that they could in their community, but they were also looking to find other women around the state who were in line, who were like-minded about the same things, and then that was kind of giving them power. You still have to deal with any local issues of people who have on the city council who don't want you to do certain things, perhaps. But I think in the, one of the women in Granite Falls says she wanted to create a mural along the community to kind of brighten up a big part of the community that was along the Minnesota River there. City council initially said, no, it's just going to invite graffiti. We don't want to do something like that. But she had a lot of other women that were on her side about it, and eventually they said, well, okay, let's try it. And now at this point, they said the city council is very excited about the fact that the arts is bringing people in to visit their city in a way that they thought the financial and hospital and nursing home kinds of things would be the centerpiece. They said now it's becoming arts. And so it's those kinds of things. More on that story will be in the December issue of how did they revitalize their community, and what did they get from the camaraderie that they were able to create. There was 7 women, and they found each other eventually because they resurrected an old building that had closed and turned it into a space for art. And then from that, all these other things grew. But it took about 10 years. But now they've really made a difference. So I think a lot of it is about trying to figure out where your peers are, and then also connecting. I really think we need much more connection around the state with each other, and that's what we're hoping to build this next year. Again, around these 4 key issues, and then find each other on subsets of other things that we care about.
Okay. Audrey.
So, I think a lot of us are impatient. Yeah, this place, First Unitarian Society, as you referenced some of its history, 100 years ago, Dietrich was talking about this, these humanist ideas. And they're still not here, and sometimes I feel like we're having setbacks in recent years. And so a lot of what you uncover are, these little pockets of things going on in people, and that just seems so slow and so small. And so can you sort of speak to, do you see an intersection with any of the big things, is it Commissioner, or what happened to Craig? Is behind, where did Craig go? I can't remember. I don't remember her first name. Commissioner Ho.
Yeah.
So she has power, some power now. So connecting sort of with the big bureaucracy or the institutions to get to that level, versus these small little initiatives that are hopeful, but they're small, and so. And I believe in them, 100%. I do small things too. So but I don't know. How do you think about the big institutional things and the small little initiatives?
I do think some of it is going to come from political leadership as we get more and more, because again, we're nowhere near 50-50 in the state in anything in terms of gender representation. And I think when we get closer to having more people elected who represent a lot of different priorities, we will move forward a lot faster, because there's still so many people in place who control the budget who don't understand an issue or don't care about an issue. I also, though, will tell you that there was amazing progress this year on sexual assault legislation, and it took several years for about 100 different people, largely women, but a whole variety of people, including defense attorneys and others. They worked for several years to revise some of the weird statutes that we had around sexual assault and to reword things and to establish new rules around things, such as the statute of limitations for reporting. And so there was Kelly Moeller was a representative, and Marion O'Neill was a representative who worked on this. They got advocates and to work with them. It wouldn't have happened if they weren't in the legislative seat. But I also know from Asma Muhammad and Sarah Super, who were really frustrated 2 years ago when some of these rules didn't change. They had so much pushback from Limmer and other people. But one of the guys that argued against what they were talking about, they had more and more one-on-one conversations with him, and he finally understood why the trauma related to sexual assault means you're not going to turn around and report it right away, that it might take you years and years to get to that point, and that it's not even necessarily about being able to prove in a court of law that this happened, but be able to heal from the process of being able to name this person and have them go through the system. So they finally were able to convince this guy that this is something that's real, and and what Asma said was, it's just you have to just keep tipping over, the little more dominoes. And I do think that that's where, when we get closer to 50-50 representation, we're going to have a much faster process. We're still just trying to get to 50-50.
Bruce, this will be the last question, and then we're going to have our social hour. And Mikki, will you be able to hang out with us for a little while?
Yep.
During a social hour?
Yep.
And by the way, for the new folks who don't know much about our organization, check us out at our website, HumanistsMN.org, and you could sign up for our newsletter for free, and I think you'll enjoy it.
I was going to ask, my brother used to be juvenile delinquent, so he knows a little about this thing, but he says that St. Paul has an even higher crime rate than Minneapolis. I wouldn't know. Believe me, I don't know. But I thought I would ask you about places like North Minneapolis, which is where I live, and really tough crime area. It's the toughest crime area in the city, I guess. But anyway, how could you do things like that art, the mural, and the way they kind of turn the city, that area around? How can you do something like that in North Minneapolis and places like that?
Our office is in North Minneapolis, and we're right across from the Cub Foods on West Broadway. And we're right at that corner where there's a tremendous amount of we're on that corner. So we're we're up a little, we're at Aldrich and West Broadway. And so that was where a woman was hit by a speeding car and died, and that was where there's been a lot of drug overdose things. There's been a tremendous amount, and there was a shooting in the building again. There had been a couple different shootings that shattered the windows. Yeah, Career Force Clinic. It's actually a city building. And it's been weird to us that there's been no police presence there, just parked there, or EMTs, because there's also a lot of overdose issues there. But I do think that one of the things that I noticed very much in North Minneapolis is they don't have a space where people can gather together very easily. There used to be a community space, and then it was bought up by somebody else outside, and now nobody can use that space anymore. The coffee shop that used to be there for community members to get together, Serendipity Spot, I don't know if you were aware of it, that got closed down. And so it's like there's this effort to not let people connect together, I think. And so there was space next to us. There was one more space left in this building, and I had been pushing the developer to say, just turn it into a public community space so that people have a chance to connect with each other. However, what they do there, there's all these great food festivals and music and things like that the community can come together around so that they're not completely demoralized by all of the violence that's happening there. So there are things like that our Nikki Levy Armstrong has been really involved in making sure people were getting masked and getting vaccines and stuff like that. There's a really strong community component there, but at the same time, the gun violence is, we've been tracking it on our website. We've had more than 80 gun homicides this year, and majority of them are in North and some in South, and it's something that's not being addressed. Yeah, Sanctuary is over there, and Shiloh Temple and stuff, and so there are, again, amazing places where community can come together in some way, but I don't think they have enough of a sense of the same kind of whole spaces. It just seems like a big gap. So, that's my, somewhat educated but not completely educated guess about what that community is really looking for. Much more public space that they own. That's a big part of it too. It's, ownership of their own buildings and creating their own businesses, so. Yeah, there is better efforts now towards trying to get land access, or a commercial building access and stuff like that. So there are a few people there that are working on that. I don't know where it's at, but but it'd be not, you know, again, you have, you know, you develop your own commercial centers around your own community, and I think that's always a positive thing. So you develop community around your neighborhood establishments, and it's still lagging there. But they're working. I know the community's working on it. So.
Well, thank you all for your questions, and thank you so much, Mikki, for gracing our Humanist Gathering, our monthly Humanist Gatherings. And we have the refreshments out. Gentlemen, Audrey, don't we ask for volunteers to push the chairs to one end of the? I think we're good. You're good? We'll hang out back here. Yeah, we normally hang out by these tables. You could stand up and have a drink and chat with your neighbors here.